Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
It all started with a side yard that had seen better days. The redwood deck was so rickety I wouldn't let my dog walk on it, let alone any guests. The yard itself was a patchy mess of dirt and weeds, and I'd been dreaming of turning it into something usable. Maybe a little oasis with some pavers, a fire pit, and some plants that didn't look like they were on their last leg. After years of saving, I finally decided to pull the trigger. I got quotes from a few landscape companies, picked one with a solid reputation, and submitted the plans to the HOA for approval. I even went door to door to my 4 neighbors in the cul-de-sac to let them know what was going on. I figured it was the polite thing to do. Everyone seemed fine with it, or so I thought. Fast forward 2 months and the project was finally done. The deck was gone, replaced with a sleek stone patio. The yard was transformed with fresh sod, a few small trees, and even a little water feature. I was thrilled. That is, until I got the letter from the HOA. It was one of those official-looking envelopes with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw it. I opened it up and there it was, a claim that my contractor had caused damage to the asphalt in the cul-de-sac during the project. The letter stated that I would be held responsible for the cost of replacing the entire asphalt surface. My jaw hit the floor. I immediately called the HOA office. "What damage are you even talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman on the other end of the line sounded like she'd been expecting my call. "We've received complaints from residents about significant damage to the asphalt," she said, her tone clipped. "You'll need to address this immediately." "Significant damage," I repeated, my voice rising. "I've been out there every day. There's no damage. What are you even talking about?" She sighed, like I was wasting her time. "The complaints came from your neighbors. They've provided photos and detailed accounts of the issues." That's when it clicked. My neighbors, the ones I'd talked to before the project started, the ones who had smiled and nodded and said, "Oh, that sounds nice," when I explained what I was doing. Turns out 2 of them were on the HOA board, and now they were claiming my contractor had destroyed the cul-de-sac. I marched outside to take a look for myself. The asphalt looked exactly the same as it had before the project started. A few cracks here and there, some patches where the trash trucks had worn it down over the years, but nothing new, nothing that screamed damage. I was fuming. I grabbed my phone and called the contractor. He was just as confused as I was. "We were careful," he said. "We didn't even bring heavy machinery back there. Just wheelbarrows and hand tools. There's no way we caused any damage." The next day I confronted my neighbors. It wasn't pretty. I saw them standing in the cul-de-sac chatting like they didn't have a care in the world. Karen was holding a coffee cup, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the ceramic, while Greg was gesturing animatedly about something, probably some new rule they were planning to push through at the next HOA meeting. They both looked so smug, so self-assured, like they were untouchable. And why wouldn't they? They were both on the HOA board. They had the power to make decisions that affected everyone in the neighborhood, and they weren't afraid to wield it. I walked right up to them, the HOA letter crumpled in my hand. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't about to back down. "Care to explain this?" I asked, holding it up so they could see the official HOA letterhead. Karen's smile faltered for a second, but she recovered quickly. She exchanged a glance with Greg, who crossed his arms and leaned back on his heels, like he was preparing for a fight. "Explain what?" Karen asked, her tone dripping with fake innocence. "That's just a standard notice from the HOA, nothing to get worked up about." They exchanged a look, and then one of them, let's call her Karen, crossed her arms and said, "We told the HOA what happened. Your contractor left a mess. There's dirt and dust everywhere, and the asphalt is ruined." "Ruined," I shot back. "Have you even looked at it? It's the same as it's always been. And you knew this project was happening. I talked to you about it. We didn't think it would be this disruptive," the other neighbor, let's call him Greg, said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "The noise, the dust, the trucks coming and going. It's been a nightmare." "The nightmare," I repeated, my voice rising. "It's been 2 months. You could have said something while it was happening. Instead, you wait until it's done and then go running to the HOA, Karen shrugged. "We're just looking out for the community. The HOA has rules for a reason." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Looking out for the community, or just looking for a way to make my life difficult? They didn't have an answer for that. Instead, they just stood there, smug and silent, like they'd already won. I wasn't about to let that happen. I demanded that the HOA bring in an asphalt expert to assess the so-called damage. They agreed reluctantly, and a few days later a representative from the asphalt company showed up. I met him outside, along with one of the HOA board members. Not Karen or Greg, thankfully. The rep took one look at the cul-de-sac and shook his head. "This isn't damage," he said. "This is normal wear and tear. If anything, the trash trucks that come through here every week are doing more harm than anything else." I turned to the HOA board member. "You hear that? There's no damage. This is ridiculous." The board member nodded, but she didn't look happy about it. "I'll take this back to the board," she said. "But you'll need to wait for their decision." "Wait," I said, my frustration boiling over. "Wait for what? There's nothing to decide. Your own expert just said there's no damage." She didn't respond. Instead, she just walked away, leaving me standing there with the asphalt rep. He gave me a sympathetic look. "Good luck," he said. "HOAs can be a nightmare. That was 5 years ago. I'm still waiting for that letter from the HOA absolving me and my contractor of any liability. Every now and then I'll get a notice about some new rule or regulation, and I'll wonder if Karen and Greg had a hand in it. I've tried to let it go, but every time I see them outside chatting like they own the place, it all comes rushing back. The worst part is, I can't even enjoy my side yard anymore. Every time I sit out there, I'm reminded of the whole mess. The patio looks great and the water feature is soothing, but it's hard to relax when you're constantly looking over your shoulder waiting for the next complaint. I've thought about selling the house and moving somewhere without an HOA, but that feels like letting them win. So for now, I'm stuck in a house I love in a neighborhood I used to like, with neighbors who seem determined to make my life miserable. The other day I saw Karen outside watering her plants. She waved at me like nothing had happened. I didn't wave back. Instead, I went inside, closed the blinds, and tried to forget about it. But I know it's not over. It never really is with people like that. For now, I'm just trying to focus on the positives. My side yard looks amazing, even if I can't fully enjoy it. And at least I know I did everything right. I got the approvals, I talked to my neighbors, and I stood up for myself when they tried to push me around. That has to count for something, right? But still, every time I get the mail, I can't help but wonder if there's another letter from the HOA waiting for me. And every time I see Karen and Greg outside, I can't help but wonder what they're plotting next. It's exhausting, honestly. But I'm not giving up, not yet. This sounds a whole lot more like two overzealous neighbors who just happen to be on the board than an actual HOA issue. Especially since you got into a verbal altercation with them in the middle of the street. This is prime example of why you take pictures before and after the job, and submit the before pictures with the initial request for work and the after pictures when it's done to show no damage was done. Like the guy said, 5 years shows some next-level patience to just now start complaining about not having some letter absolving you of additional wear and tear on a street. Board meetings must be spectacular with the hidden animosity between you and the two neighbor board members. If the HOA owns the road, and if the road were actually damaged, then the damage would be an HOA issue. And since the homeowner contracted the vendor, the HOA would probably have to force the homeowner to fix it, and then the homeowner would have to go after the vendor. I'm guessing, though, that the board members wasted everyone's money by asking the HOA lawyer to go after OP, and then the lawyer laughed at them and told them no once they found out none of the professionals actually agree that there's any damage. But the HOA officers couldn't just admit that they're assholes and were wrong, so they just silently didn't tell anyone about it.
If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day.
It was the summer of 2008, and I found myself in a whirlwind romance that would change my perspective on life forever. I was dating Sophia, a girl from a world so different from mine it might as well have been another planet, growing up with a single dad who was more like an annoyed older brother than a father figure. I was used to trailer parks and my Grammy's house. My early 20s were a mess of trouble and bad decisions, but then I met Sophia at a scenester dance party, and everything changed. Sophia was breathtaking, with long chestnut hair and eyes that sparkled like stars. She came from money, old money, and I was fascinated by her world. Despite our obvious differences, we hit it off immediately. Her laughter was infectious, and her kindness seemed genuine. I thought maybe, just maybe, this could work. One balmy evening in July, Sophia invited me to dinner at her parents' house. As I drove my beat-up Honda Civic through the winding roads leading out of the city, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. I had never met anyone's parents before, let alone parents who probably made more money in a year than I'd see in a lifetime. As I approached the gated community, my jaw dropped. The entrance was flanked by massive stone pillars, with an ornate wrought iron gate that looked like it belonged in front of a European castle. A uniformed guard checked my name against a list and waved me through with a look that said, "You don't belong here, kid." The neighborhood was unlike anything I'd ever seen outside of movies. Sprawling mansions dotted the landscape, each one more opulent than the last. Manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, interrupted only by the occasional tennis court or Olympic-sized swimming pool. Some houses even had separate guest houses that were bigger than any place I'd ever lived. I felt like I had stepped into a different world. The air seemed cleaner, the grass greener, and even the sky looked bluer. It was as if money could buy a better version of reality itself. As I navigated through the winding streets trying to find Sophia's house, something caught my eye. Amidst all the perfection, there was one property that stood out like a sore thumb. The yard was overgrown, with unruly shrubs and trees that hadn't seen pruning shears in months. It wasn't a complete disaster, but in this neighborhood of immaculate perfection, it might as well have been a jungle. I finally found Sophia's house, a massive Georgian-style mansion with columns that reminded me of the White House. As I parked my car next to a line of luxury vehicles that probably cost more than my entire life savings, I took a deep breath and tried to calm my nerves. Sophia greeted me at the door with a warm smile and a quick kiss. "Don't worry," she whispered. "They'll love you." I wasn't so sure, but I plastered on my best smile and followed her inside. The interior of the house was just as impressive as the exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum adorned the walls. I felt like I should be wearing white gloves just to touch anything. Sophia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Worthington, were waiting for us in the living room. Mr. Worthington was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a permanent frown etched on his face. Mrs. Worthington was petite and perfectly coiffed, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So you're the young man our Sophia has been talking about," Mr. Worthington said, giving me a once-over that made me feel like I was being appraised at a cattle auction. "It's nice to meet you, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for having me over for dinner," Mrs. Worthington chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Of course, dear, we're always happy to meet Sophia's friends." The emphasis on friends wasn't lost on me. It was clear they didn't see me as a potential long-term prospect for their daughter. Dinner was a tense affair. The food was exquisite, dishes I couldn't even pronounce, let alone afford, but the conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. Mr. Worthington grilled me about my job. I was working as a barista at the time, my education, community college dropout, and my future plans, non-existent. With each answer I could see the disapproval in their eyes growing. Desperate to change the subject, I brought up the house I had noticed earlier. I couldn't help but notice one of the properties on the way in looked a bit different from the others. "Is everything okay with that family?" The change in atmosphere was immediate. Mr. Worthington's face darkened, and Mrs. Worthington let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, you must be referring to the Johnsons," Mr. Worthington said, his voice laced with disdain. "They've become quite the thorn in our side." Mrs. Worthington nodded in agreement. "It's simply unacceptable. They're bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood." Sophia looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I pressed on, curious about the story behind this family that seemed so out of place in this perfect world. "What happened to them?" I asked. Mr. Worthington launched into the tale, his voice filled with a mix of anger and what sounded almost like glee. "Robert Johnson used to be quite successful in investment banking. They moved in about 5 years ago, fit right in with the community, but then the market started to turn and he made some poor decisions. Not to mention their child," Mrs. Worthington added, lowering her voice as if she was sharing a scandalous secret. "They have a son with special needs, requires round-the-clock care. Mrs. Johnson had to quit her job to take care of him." I felt a pang of sympathy for the Johnsons. "That must be really tough for them," I said. Mr. Worthington scoffed. "Tough? Please, we all have our challenges. That doesn't give them the right to let their property fall into disrepair and drag down the rest of us with them." "But surely there's something that can be done to help them," I suggested, immediately regretting my words as I saw the looks on their faces. "Help them," Mr. Worthington repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. "Young man, this is not a charity. We have standards in this community, and if the Johnsons can't meet them, they need to leave. Robert's just feeling sorry for himself," Mrs. Worthington added. "If he pulled himself together and got a better job, they wouldn't be in this mess." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people, living in the lap of luxury, were gleefully discussing the downfall of their neighbors who had fallen on hard times. "So what's going to happen to them?" I asked, dreading the answer. Mr. Worthington smiled. and it was a cold, calculating expression that sent a chill down my spine. Well, as a member of the HOA board, I can tell you that we're issuing them fines for their landscaping violations. Substantial fines. And if they can't pay, well, we'll have no choice but to put a lien on their house. But that could force them out of their home, I protested, unable to keep the shock out of my voice. Exactly, Mrs. Worthington said with a satisfied nod. And then someone who can actually maintain the property can move in. I looked at Sophia, hoping to see some sign of disagreement or discomfort with her parents' attitude, but she just stared at her plate, pushing her food around with her fork. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the Johnsons, imagining their struggles and the added stress of dealing with neighbors who seemed to take pleasure in their misfortune. As I drove home that night, I knew in my heart that Sophia and I were doomed. Our worlds were too different, our values too far apart. I couldn't imagine being part of a community that valued perfectly manicured lawns over compassion and human decency. Over the next few weeks, Sophia and I drifted apart. She sensed my discomfort with her family and their lifestyle, and I couldn't pretend to be okay with it. We broke up amicably, both realizing that we were from different worlds that could never truly mesh. Years have passed since that summer, but I still think about the Johnsons sometimes. I wonder what happened to them, if they managed to keep their home or if they were forced out by the relentless pressure of the HOA and their unsympathetic neighbors. That experience changed me. It made me appreciate my own humble beginnings and the sense of community I'd always taken for granted. In my crappy trailer park, we might not have much, but we look out for each other. When times are tough, neighbors pitch in to help, not gleefully wait for a chance to kick someone when they're down. Now, as I sit on my rickety porch, surrounded by my collection of tacky garden gnomes and half-finished project cars, I can't help but smile. My life might not be perfect, and I'll probably never live in a multi-million-dollar mansion, but I'm happy. I have friends who accept me for who I am, neighbors who wave and smile instead of judging the state of my lawn, and the freedom to live my life without the constant pressure of keeping up appearances. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly reflective, I raise a can of cheap beer and a silent toast to the Johnsons, wherever they might be now. I hope they found their way to a place where they're valued for who they are, not the state of their landscaping. And I silently thank them for the lesson they unknowingly taught me, that true wealth isn't measured in square footage or the size of your bank account, but in the kindness and compassion you show to others. As for HOAs, you couldn't pay me to live in one. I'll take my tacky decorations, project cars, and genuine neighbors any day of the week. After all, a little imperfection is what makes life interesting, isn't it? I've been in my place for a year, and I found out that as long as you kiss their asses you're good, but I found out the hard way that lesson. I got invited for coffee and a smoke to the tables in the common area. I went for a few months, and they started talking about just about everyone. Anne is difficult because she doesn't understand or speak English well. Sharon is just an old pain-in-the-ass bitch. She's 89 years old with a walker. Patty is just poor. Her husband must not have provided well before he died. These were comments made by the HOA president. We are a 20-unit community of people 63 to 89 years old. I wrote to the management company to let them know this kind of talk is wrong and suggest he speak to her. They have singled me out several times over crap that wasn't what they thought. I believe if you run an HOA, you should at least have to treat all residents with respect and not gossip to others behind their backs. I'm now the shit stirrer, and none of them speak to me, which I'm okay with.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.